Okay, can you guys see the slides full screen and nothing else? Is that right? Fantastic. I see some nods and some thumbs ups. That is excellent. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you all so much for coming to this talk. My name's Mark. Although I'm from the UK, I do now live in Sydney, so it's quite late at night here. Thank you all so much for coming to this talk. So this is, although my academic work is focused on Twitch and esports and also on loot boxes. In fact, this paper is nothing to do with that at all. This paper is to do with a hobbyist game design project, which I started 10 years ago, which has spiraled monstrously out of control to become this kind of gigantic thing. And through this, I want to kind of explore a few questions about how we think about immersion in games and how we think about game worlds and what's in those worlds and what should be in those worlds and what it is about some sorts of game worlds which make us feel very immersed in, air quotes, in that world, and what sorts of worlds we don't feel especially immersed in. So first off, a tragic start. Sadly, I don't feel immersed in games a great deal when I play games. I experience fun, I experience enjoyment, I experience challenge, I experience being puzzled or being intrigued and all these sorts of things, and that's all great. But for me and how I think about immersion myself, it's quite a rare thing for me. And clearly, immersion, as we've talked through in this conference, and as we all know, can mean a wide range of things. But for me, immersion is the kind of feeling of being in a game world, a game place of some sort, which is very detailed and very convincing and very well thought through and self-consistent, and somewhere which feels like a real place rather than a level in a game or something of this sort. And this is the case in the real world too. I've always had quite a strong sense of fun, vey, or wanderlust, but I think it's intriguing to think about this in the context of game worlds, where, like I say, when so many game worlds, when you think about them outside of the game context, don't make much sense, right? You don't have puzzles in the real world in someone's house. You don't have these sorts of things. But there's very few game worlds which are built to give this sense of being in a very distinctive, a very real, a very kind of actualized place. But if we want to think about this and how we might create game worlds which feel like kind of complete immersive worlds, which is what lots of blockbuster games and so on often promise and fall short on, I think it's worth thinking about this in terms of procedural content generation. If you've not heard this term, this is games where there's a AI system which creates some aspect of that game different every time you play it. So games like The Binding of Isaac or No Man's Sky or FTL and things of this sort are well known for this, where each time you play, the game world is different in some way, or there's a different set of items or enemies or things of this sort. And one of the goals here is to create a very high sense of replayability for the player, and also a high variety in what kinds of worlds, what kinds of things the player can come across. And while PCG in general, I think, is something we tend to associate with indie games rather than kind of blockbuster games. I hate saying AAA games, it's the worst phrase, so we'll go with blockbuster games. We do see it in a few of these games. If you played Skyrim, if you played the 2018, I think, the 2018 God of War, you will have found that there are some PCG aspects of those games. And in these games, it tends to be that, say, 99% of the game world has been handcrafted by the people who made that game, but then some little subsection is PCG'd instead. So, for instance, in Skyrim, you had those, I think they called them radiant quests, I think, in Skyrim, where you can keep having the game create new quests for you and things of this sort. And in God of War, the Niflheim area was this kind of fog-covered maze, and the maze changed every time you played it. And in general, in these games, the PCG content is kind of end game stuff in general, and in most cases for the most hardcore, in air quotes, players, the people for whom this game is a kind of central core part of their gaming, or they want to really exhaust everything that game has to offer. But whether it's an indie or in blockbuster games, PCG is in general used to create spaces in most cases and to populate those sorts of spaces with items, weapons, doors, keys, foes, secrets, paths, all these sorts of things, although exceptions do exist in this. But the issue here is that these sorts of created worlds created by AI systems in these sorts of games tend not to have much of a sense of immersion, much of a sense of place, a sense of realness to them. A really striking case here is Bloodborne, where the main game is full of these astonishingly intricate, precise, labyrinthine game spaces, which feel incredibly real and dense and lived in. But then the PCG part is just so clearly built from just pieces that were stitched onto the end of each other. And the two are quite jarring, given that they take place within the same game. So 10 years ago, when I started my PhD, and for some reason I thought a second life-changing massive project at the same time would be a really great idea, I asked myself, can we create a system that can create a world which looks handmade? So get those upsides of handmade worlds which feel extremely kind of real and dense and lived in, while also create a system which can create lots of these worlds and do it in one sense quite cheaply, rather than expecting large game dev teams to spend months or years and so on creating these kinds of worlds. So can we combine these two approaches to how we might make game worlds? Yes, we can, in fact. So I started making this game 10 years back. And in essence, this is a roguelike style game where you explore a sort of scientific revolution era world with the goal of solving a kind of cryptic riddle within that game world. And to do that, you need to talk to people, you need to read books, you need to look at maps, you need to check up historical obscure records in archives, and all this sort of stuff is created by the game's AI. So even when I play it, I don't know where the clues will be and what sorts of clues will be created. And here's a kind of quick shot of what the game looks like. So this is the player looking at the world map and looking at who owns parts of the world map. This is the player walking around and taking a look at some shop signs inside the city. Then the player goes inside a shop and has a look at some shields the shop is selling. Every single one of these shields is unique. There's something like 1 billion or so shields the game can create. Now we're talking to someone, every sentence you and the other person says are also procedurally created and so on. And then at the end of this little clip, the player will try to buy something. So every aspect of this game world is created by the game's AI, and the goal here was to create a world where both it varies every time you play, of course, but also that if the player didn't know this world had been created by an AI, it should be convincing enough as a handmade world to seem to be such. So, for instance, every time the world's made, it creates a map, creates a bunch of nations and so on, gives each one a flag. The flags are also, of course, generated by the game. And then if we zoom in, we have cities and towns and forts and settlements and all these sorts of things. If we zoom in further within those, every single building is also procedurally created. Every nation has its own architectural style. And the idea being that the player should be able over the time to recognize things from a given culture within this game world. If we zoom in further, every single object within this game world is also created by the game's AI, whether it's clothes or vases or graves or chairs or beds or whatever. Everything has a style which changes every time you play. And this also applies to items. So here's a set of books, for instance, and every book within the game world has an appearance which yields some kind of hint at what it might contain. And this also in turn applies to every item within the game world. So every single one of these, which you see now, is completely unique. Most of these have hundreds of millions of options. So no player will ever, I hope, see the same helmet, the same crossbow, the same book, the same plate, the same shield, the same pocket watch, the same pickaxe, and so forth. And there's also, of course, people who move around the right-hand side and have PCG faces as well. So in creating this world, like I say, the goal was to kind of explore, can I make a world which looks like it's so detailed and gives a sense of being handmade, that if one didn't know it had been created by an AI, that it could have been handmade. So one of the core things I wanted to kind of pursue here was the sense of lived-in-ness. And so when I started this project, I set the world should not appear to have been designed as a kind of design goal in some sense. As in, it should not appear like a Legend of Zelda dungeon where the entire dungeon's a set of puzzles, but we don't have dungeons full of puzzles in the real world, so that makes no sense. But it should be more like a Dark Souls game or a Bloodborne game where you get this sense that not so much that you are playing a level within a game, but more like you are exploring a real space within a world. And this space has a past, it has art, it has architecture, it reflects ideas and events and the people who live there and these sorts of things. But this kind of lived-in-ness, I think, is quite hard to get in games because in most cases, if it's a puzzle game, every level must have a puzzle, but the real world does not contain puzzles in rooms, right? So it's quite hard, I think, to get this sense of sort of convincing lived-in-ness that you are exploring a space in which people inhabit and have done so, rather than a set of game levels. And clearly, this is not a kind of design goal which has to be there for every kind of game, of course. But for immersion games, as I think of that term, I think it's important that these games have this real sense, like I say, of being lived in. And so this kind of focus on architecture, on clothing, or on repeating visual styles. And that's one thing when you have a game dev team of 500 people and years to do it and so on. But in terms of trying to get a procedural content creation system to create these kinds of worlds, oh, that wasn't meant to happen yet. Pretend you didn't see that. So the goal here was that I wanted to kind of evoke this sense of kind of falling down a rabbit hole when you play this game and you find this kind of entire and complete game world there. And so one of the core parts here was to create this kind of consistent aesthetics for everything within a given culture. So when the game creates an in-game culture, it chooses what sorts of colors, what sorts of shapes it likes, what sorts of language it uses, what sorts of concepts it cares a lot about, and so on. So on a purely aesthetic level, for instance, if you come across lots of things of the same kind of color, and here there's lots of circles in these objects, then that should give the player a hint that these sorts of things come from the same culture. And when every single one of these graphics is also in turn procedurally created on top of the rules which are procedurally created themselves, which govern what kinds of objects can appear and how those objects should look, what you wind up with, I hope, is this sense that you are seeing something which is very distinctive and something which is very unique to your playthrough. And the more and more of this which I've added over the last 10 years, the kind of deeper and denser this sense of being in a unique and a kind of distinctive and lived in space has become, I hope. But also one aspect of this, and there's a few other PCG games which do things like this, like Dwarf Fortress and Caves of Cud and things like this, which is the idea that everything which is created within a game world should be able to reference everything else. So you should be able to meet someone who talks about a book, and then if you find that book talks about a place, and then if you go to that place, maybe the character lives there, that type of thing. So every aspect of this game world should, in some sense, refer to every other aspect of this game world. And as social scientists / humanities researchers and so on, I think we all get that sense in the real world, where that kind of complexity of how we think about all the items in the real world and where they came from and how we think of them and why we have them and all these sorts of things. I wanted to kind of evoke that sense in the real world where you could look at a book and look up the author and then look up the author and then see their next book and then look at where they lived and then go to where they lived and see where they were born and all these sorts of things. All of these sorts of links which imply the real complexity of the real world, I wanted to try to capture here. And this is also quite different from what most other procedurally created games do, in that in most kind of classic roguelikes, pieces are placed in the game world without any reference to the kind of content of what those pieces are. So you might create a dungeon level and you place a staircase there, a fountain there, a chest there, some goblins there, a dragon there, this type of stuff. But when you kind of step back, you think, well, this makes no sense. Why is that fountain there? Why are those stairs there? Why is this dragon here? Why doesn't the dragon eat those goblins? Why is all this stuff here? And what kind of logic and sense does this make? So a kind of average map, for instance, in a classic roguelike might look like this, and this is a map from a classic roguelike game called Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup. And this is no snark at that game. I think that game's great. But this map, of course, I don't think there's any real building or real structure on the face of the earth whose floor plan looks like that, even remotely. I don't think. Maybe there's like a catacomb beneath a European capital somewhere which vaguely looks like this. Maybe, I don't know. But real buildings and real structures don't look like this. By contrast, for instance, here's a castle from my game where this is a culture which likes crosses as shapes, so it's a cross-shaped castle and so on, but every room is linked up. There's no space between rooms and so on, and although you can't see it here, every room is kind of next to other rooms, which it makes sense to be next to, right? So the guards' quarters are next to the kitchens, these sorts of things. But also, I wanted to go further for some reason, which is that some of you who've read stuff on procedural content creation before will know this kind of issue of, although a procedural system can create difference, it's not necessarily guaranteed to create intriguing or worthwhile difference. And Kate Compton talked about this idea in terms of the 10,000 bowls of plain oatmeal. As in, you could have a system where if your game contains bowls of oatmeal, then you could have everyone different, and you could write a piece of code which makes every oat in every bowl of oatmeal different. But so what? What does that matter? It adds no interest. It adds no intrigue, because A, they are all sufficiently like each other, and B, none of them by themselves are of any interest. So to try to fix this, I built a technique in here, which, as far as I know, this is the only game which does this technique, although I might be wrong, whereby anytime some aspect of the game is made, a nation, a piece of clothing, a building, whatever, the game keeps track of what's just been made and specifically makes sure later things of that type are not at all like the thing which was just made. So everything the game makes is stored, and then whenever the game next comes to make that type of thing again, it keeps trying to make one over and over and over until it finds one which is different enough from the one which you've just seen. And this system takes a lot of time to build, because like I, as the designer, have to have a good sense of what makes two pieces of clothing too much like each other to be okay and so on. But although it takes time, I think it yields very good results where I hope you should never come across stuff in the game world which just looks like other stuff in that game world because of these sorts of systems. And in turn, also, when the game creates its worlds, the rules by which those worlds are created are themselves created by the game's AI. So some worlds will contain things that other worlds don't at all. And so not just are the things within the worlds created by these sorts of systems, but rather the systems themselves are created when you start the game and try to create a new world. And so not all worlds contain all items, all cultures, all structures, characters, and so on. And so not just is each game world unique, I hope, but also the parameters by which what goes into that game world are chosen is also unique. And this is something for the player to find, in a sense, much like in the real world. So to sum up, this is a kind of weird think piece, and I hope that what I've said here makes sense. But I think immersion in game worlds is something which, in terms of this feeling of being in a real, fully fleshed out place, I think is something we don't think about a lot in terms of immersion, compared to things like how much players having fun, how much time is passing, these sorts of things. And while procedural content creation techniques can be lots of things, in lots of cases, these seams show through, and we can kind of tell this map, this dungeon, this whatever, was not handmade by a designer. But I think as a core design goal, if you want to create a game specifically built to build worlds that look unique and special and strange in some way, then that can be done. And there's a quote here from a Swiss sculptor, at least I think it is. I mean, I can't find the first source of this quote, and this is off the internet, so it might be from some other person, I don't know, but assuming it is from this guy, I think this quote is great. The object of art is not to reproduce reality, but to create one of the same intensity. And that's kind of what I've been trying to do with this game. So this is an ongoing project. Hopefully 1.0 will arrive before I die of old age, but you never know these things for sure. If you're keen, please do go and check out the game and get lost in that world, and I'd love to hear what you think. So thanks so much. Do give me a shout on Twitter or by email if you'd like to get in touch. And thank you everyone for listening.